Thomas Paine, the man whose words helped start and save the American Revolutionary War. In 1737, Thomas Paine was born in England, in a small village called Thetford, 80 miles north of London. At age 37, he met Benjamin Franklin, who convinced him to move to America, so he set sail and 3 months later arrived in Philadelphia. It is important to note that in 1775, just after Thomas Paine arrived in America, there is little talk of separation, or independence, or revolution. The American people just want the British Parliament to either stop raising their taxes or give them seats in Parliament. In fact, that was the goal of the Boston Tea Party a year earlier: no taxation without representation. Also, many Americans today might be surprised by two things about the Revolutionary War. First, in 1775, just 1 year before declaring independence, most American colonists wanted to be British subjects. Many colonists loved and admired the king, and most Americans were proud to be members of the world's most powerful military and economic empire, the British Empire. But the events in the year 1775, including the British siege and occupation of Boston, the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, and the very powerful influence of Thomas Paine's book Common Sense, would all dramatically change public opinion, and within 6 months, the American people would be calling for and fighting for independence. Secondly, most Americans today don't realize that the first year of the Revolutionary War was a complete disaster, and that 3 times George Washington and the colonial army came within hours of total defeat. Once again, Thomas Paine will step in and help turn that disastrous situation into America's first military victory and eventual independence. Thomas Paine's first book, Common Sense, laid out a straightforward, logical, easy-to-understand explanation for why Americans should declare independence. First, why should a tiny island rule and control a huge, distant continent? It's clearly impractical and illogical. He also attacked hereditary monarchy, showing how silly it is to expect any son to be as wise or skilled as the father. Thus, any stupid, incompetent son could easily inherit the power to rule over an entire nation, which, as he pointed out, happened often in the past. Third, even if we signed a peace treaty and gave up independence, the events of the last 6 months showed that England would treat the people of America very harshly whenever they complained. Would Americans want to live forever under the constant threat of sieges, martial law, and violent suppression? Would Americans want to live the next century under the iron fist of the British rule? Common Sense also addressed people's very real concerns about independence, such as military defense, economics, and political chaos. First, he explained that with our massive forests, we could use all that wood and our extensive shipbuilding skills to quickly build a powerful navy. Secondly, with our vast supply of natural resources, we could soon make America an international economic powerhouse without any need for England's help. Lastly, and most importantly, he allayed people's fears about social chaos by showing how we could create a government with representatives from each state so everyone would have an equal say in how they were governed. Common Sense ended with the call for an immediate and clear declaration of independence from England, for if not now, when? These and the other ideas in Common Sense were so logical and straightforward that they made sense to the average common man. Instantly the book went viral, and within a few months everyone was discussing his ideas in pubs, coffee houses, over dinner tables, and even in churches. Then, only 6 months after its publication, Common Sense had almost completely transformed public opinion against the king and for separation, and the Continental Congress would implement one of Paine's most significant ideas, writing and signing the Declaration of Independence, and the Revolutionary War officially began. Unfortunately, the first year didn't go well. It started on Long Island, where George Washington had positioned his 10,000 poorly trained, ill-equipped army to defend Brooklyn Heights, which was on the high ground overlooking and therefore controlling Lower Manhattan and New York Harbor. But the British invasion force was massive, with 45 gunships and 30,000 well-trained, well-equipped troops, 3 times the size of the American army. The British sent one part of their army to directly confront the American front lines, but secretly sent another part of their army on a long march to go around the back and encircle Washington's troops. Caught by surprise, Washington's troops quickly retreated, suffering many casualties, but now they were trapped. The British surrounded them on 3 sides, and the East River was on the other side, and in the next few days the gunships would sail up the river and bombard the colonial army, and they would be forced to surrender. It was a devastating and desperate situation. After only 1 week of fighting, they would lose the war, and the revolution would be lost. Then a small miracle occurred. As night fell, a very thick fog rolled in. Washington decided to try to escape across the East River. They got all the boats they could, and hour after hour loaded up their horses, cannons, and the remaining 9,000 troops into boats that they carefully and silently rowed across the mile-wide river, back and forth all night from midnight until daybreak. When the morning came and the fog lifted, the British were shocked to see that the American army was gone. It was a narrow and harrowing escape, and if it hadn't been for the fog, Washington would have had to surrender in August 1776, and America's history would have been far different. The next few months would be almost as bad. First, Washington retreated to Upper Manhattan. Some of the British forces followed him, while other forces took ships and landed in the Bronx in order to surround the American army. Washington barely escaped again. Leaving some of his troops to defend the fort overlooking the Hudson, he took the rest of his troops and headed for White Plains, where the British eventually caught up with them. For the second time, the Americans were overwhelmed in battle by the British, and defeat was once again imminent, and George Washington knew he would be forced to surrender the next morning. And once again weather intervened. A torrential rainstorm halted the British, and the Americans were able to escape into the wooded hills and further up into upstate New York. For the second time, Washington's army was within hours of defeat and surrender and the complete loss of the Revolutionary War. As Washington's troops made the very, very long, painful, and difficult march down through New Jersey, the British decided to go back and conquer the rest of Manhattan. Washington finally reached Fort Lee in November 1776, where Thomas Paine was a volunteer soldier. Because of Paine's fame and celebrity for writing Common Sense, he had been made an aide to the general in charge of Fort Lee. George Washington and Thomas Paine met there and became best friends. But tragedy quickly struck again. As George Washington and Thomas Paine stood on the high cliffs of Fort Lee and looked across to Manhattan, they saw the horror of the American fort being overrun and 3,000 American troops being captured and killed by the British. George Washington was devastated. He watched helplessly as 1/3 of his remaining forces were destroyed. It was another dark day for the Revolution. But there was little time for reflection, because a few days later, the British launched a nighttime sneak attack on Fort Lee. The American army was able to get away just hours before the British arrived, but they had to leave almost all of their supplies behind. They then raced to the one and only bridge across the Hackensack River and their only chance of escape. For the third time, Washington's army got away only hours before certain capture and defeat. The American army had just gotten across the bridge and were about to dismantle the bridge when the British arrived. This time, Washington had escaped by only minutes, and that bridge has since been designated the bridge that saved a nation. The American Army then made a hasty, long, and desperate retreat down into Pennsylvania. Thomas Paine witnessed all this horror, and somewhere on that long, desperate retreat, Thomas Paine sat down, using a drum as a table, and wrote his second pamphlet, American Crisis. After a very long and arduous march, George Washington's troops finally got far enough away from the British to set up camp. Instead of chasing Washington's beleaguered and ruined army, the British decided to return to the cities, such as New York City, Princeton, and Trenton, so they would have good shelter from the coming winter snows. In contrast, the American army was in dire straits. They had a makeshift camp with horrific conditions. There were few tents, little food, poor clothing, and many sick and wounded soldiers. Most of the troops were cold, hungry, and demoralized, and they wanted to quit. Once again, Thomas Paine would step in and completely change people's attitudes and opinions about their situation and about the Revolution. His second pamphlet was called American Crisis, and it began with the famous line, "These are the times that try men's souls." He reminded them that if they weathered this adversity and fought on regardless, that they will always be remembered as heroes. He showed that even though there had been numerous defeats, that the American army had actually been brave and at times fought well, partially wounding and diminishing the British forces. So, if they could just continue to fight on as hard, victories will soon come. And lastly, he gave them hope by arguing that when other states see the danger, they will soon be sending large militia reinforcements, which will soon create an American army larger than the British army. Lastly, in another famous passage, he says he met a man with a child who said he just wanted peace in his day, to which Thomas Paine replied, "Better that the war take place now, in our generation, so our children can live in peace." The pamphlet was once again a big hit and a big seller. George Washington was elated. On December 23rd, he had it read to all of his troops, and it worked like an elixir. The mood instantly changed from devastation to elation. The troops suddenly became motivated and ready to fight. Like a coach giving a moving, inspirational pep talk to a team that was losing badly, he motivated the American army to go out and overcome the odds and win a victory. The next night, George Washington and the American army would cross the Delaware, conquer Trenton, and have the first important major victory of the Revolutionary War. From that point on, the tide had turned, and there would be many more victories until a few years later, we would win the war and win our independence. Thomas Paine was a national hero. It is no exaggeration to say that Thomas Paine both helped start and save the American Revolutionary War.